Hi guys, so last time we talked about the properties of a rock. So we talked about sorting rocks by color, sorting rocks by size, sorting rocks by shape, and also sorting rocks by if they were smooth or bumpy, by their textures, and maybe we talked about maybe your rocks were shiny or had speckles or were different types of colors. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at these same rocks. So if you still have your rocks, you can get them out as well. And we describe the different kinds of rocks, asking for their properties. Now we're going to post a question of what happens when rocks rub together. So what happens when rocks rub together? So what does happen when rocks rub together? We can find out by actually rubbing the rocks together. I am going to start by rubbing the same pair of rocks together and then seeing what happens. So these are the same type of rock, these are the same type of rock, and these are the same type of rock. So I'm going to start by rubbing these two rocks together. They're the same type of rock. So I'm going to rub and see what happens. So I kind of produced, if you guys can see it, there's a lot of stuff that came off of that rock. And it has like a gritty texture, and it's red. Now if I rub these two rocks together, let's see what happens. We have a same thing. Some stuff came off. Came off in bigger chunks, and it is white, and it has like a chalky feel to it. And now we're going to rub these last two together, and it's going to make that scratching noise that doesn't sound so good. This one, nothing came off on that one. So observing what happened, when I rubbed these two rocks together, they're really light. They don't weigh a lot, and their texture is rough and bumpy. And when I rubbed them together, a lot of stuff came off. These guys, they're hard. They weigh a little bit more, but still are kind of light. And when I rubbed them together, bigger chunks came off, but not as much as the red rock. And these guys are really heavy and hard. And when I rubbed them together, nothing came off on those. So tiny rock pieces broke off and fell onto the paper. Some of the rocks are harder than others, and they didn't really, nothing rubbed off on them. If I rub two different types of rocks together, Let's see what happens then. So when I rubbed this harder rock on the softer, lighter rock, a lot of stuff came off. So I'm thinking when I rub this really hard rock onto the red rock, even more. A lot, even more stuff came off. And it started to it looked like it was dust coming off of it. If I rub this rock with this rock, you can see a little bit comes off, but I can tell on this rock that parts of the rock are rubbing off onto the rock. And when I rub these guys, it kind of made scratches on the rocks. Even though nothing fell off, there were still scratches being made on the rocks. If I collect all of this and I move it into one spot, I have a mixture of all these different types of rocks kind of put together. What's here is rock debris, and that's what happens when you rub some rocks together, is that you get rock debris. If we're talking about, there's a special type of person who studies rocks, like a scientist, and they have a special name. A scientist that studies rocks is called a geologist. So a geologist is, what a geologist does is they study geology. Geology is the study of rocks. So a geologist is a person who studies rocks. They study what happens when rocks rub together. They study different kinds of rocks, formations of rocks, and how rocks might change. So if we answer this question, what happens when rocks rub together? Tiny pieces of rock broke off. Rocks left marks on other rocks, and maybe in some rocks we didn't see a lot of stuff fall off. What do you think we should call the tiny pieces of rocks that came off of the rocks rubbed together? What does this look like to you guys? Hopefully some of you have said sand, because it's sand, or rock dust. We could call it both. But to me, it looks more like sand. Did each type of rock change in the same way? Not really. Some changed very little, some stayed the same, and some of the rocks produced a lot of sand or a lot of rock dust. So the rocks didn't change in the same way. And there was a rock that made the dust a lot easier. For me, it was my red rock. And when I touch this, it feels really, really gritty, like sand would. So when rocks rub or bang against each other, small pieces can break off. This is called weathering. So weathering causes rocks to break into smaller pieces. The small pieces of rock that feel rough and gritty are sand. So weathering is when small pieces of rock break off when they rub together. And it causes the rocks to break up into smaller pieces. And what is left is called sand. So when the effect of rubbing rocks together is that rocks get tiny and they get smaller and bits of them fall off, and those tiny pieces are sand, which is caused by weathering. So if you think about the rocks that you've seen outdoors, and you see big rocks, eventually those rocks may break down into smaller rocks, and those smaller rocks may break down into even smaller rocks, which then eventually maybe they'll break down into sand. They might rub together in the outdoors by rolling down a hill, or if you have a rock slide where they slide down from a mountain. And weathering doesn't exactly happen as fast as it did here, where we rub the rocks together. Weathering happens over time. So it takes time for weathering to happen. We can rub rocks together in a short period of time, but in nature, the process gets lots of sand would take a long time. So those sandy beaches that you've been to by the ocean, that sand has taken a long time to make, because we just made this much amount. So think about those beaches that have tons and tons of sand piled up on them. So what we're going to do now is I want you to get your science notebook out. Take our rocks away. Get our science notebook out. We're going to be on this page that says Investigation 1.1. Focus question. What happens when rocks rub together? In today's investigation, we looked at 3 rocks and saw what happened when we rubbed the rocks together. So the date, I'm going to write the date. The date is 9-24-20. Okay, it says, number 1, write what you observed. So what did we observe? So think about some things that you observed happening. One thing that I saw happening was, I'm going to say, I observed some rocks making a lot of sand and some rocks not making any sand. So if you want to, you can pause the video right here and write what my observation, or you could write your own observation. So what did you observe? What did you observe happening when I rubbed the rocks together? You can copy mine, or you can write your own observations. Number 2, you can draw a picture of what happened. So if I want to write, these were my red rocks. And when I rubbed my red rocks together, it made lots and lots of sand. If I rubbed my kind of jagged white rocks together, it didn't make as much, but it made a little bit, and they were bigger. They were bigger pieces of rock. If I rubbed my small, hard rocks together, they didn't really make anything. But when I rubbed these two together, the hard and the soft, it made tons of little types of sand all over my page. When I rubbed these 2 rocks together, it made big chunks of rock, but not as fine. So you can pause your video here and draw a picture Okay, so I'm gonna label my, says number 3, label your picture. So this is my red rocks. These are my white rocks. And these right here were my gray rocks. And then I'm gonna also label this as sand. Okay, and this also as sand. Okay. So if you need to pause it, you can, and draw your own picture and labels. You can pause it right here. Going on, investigation 1.1, the next page, it says wrapping it all up. So these are some of the words that we learned. So we learned what a geologist is, a person who studies rock. We learned what sand is, which is little pieces of rock that have been rubbed together. We learned what a rock is. And we learned what weathering is. So weathering is what happens when rocks rub together. So, number 1, a scientist who studies rocks is called a blank. So this is where you are going to write, what is a scientist who studies rock called? Right, it's a geologist. A geologist is a person who studies rock. When someone rubs 2 rocks together, they are making, what are they making when they rub 2 rocks together? Right, sand. They are making sand. Number 3, we are geologists because we are studying, what are you guys studying? We're studying rocks, right? That's what geologists do. They study rocks. And number 4, rocks break into smaller and smaller pieces because of weathering. They break up because of weathering. So you can stop or pause the video to fill those in and finish, and then you can put your science notebook away, and I will see you next time for our next science lesson.